Good evening, everyone. I am Sarah Meister. I'm a curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And as you can tell, I'm not at the museum. I am live streaming from my home, actually my mother's home. That's her phone, sorry. That's her orchid. But I'm thrilled to be joined by the esteemed scholars. Could somebody get that? Khalil Muhammad and Nicole Fleetwood. Hi, Khalil. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to be with us tonight. I am fortunate to have participated in a virtual view live Q&A in April, but then as now, my colleagues and I deeply regret that we can't welcome you into the galleries at the museum. But we remain grateful for these opportunities to bring the museum to you in your homes and the art that we care about. Tonight, we're going to focus on Gordon Parks, a photographer who described himself as an objective reporter with a subjective heart. He spoke for people who couldn't speak for themselves, and in that way, he says he spoke for himself. But through their groundbreaking research and persuasive writing, Nicole and Khalil have similarly dedicated their professional lives to attend to people whose stories aren't told, examining in particular the devastating and racially biased impact of mass incarceration in our country. Before we talk about Parks, I also want to welcome our amazing community of MoMA members and donors. Your support at this critical time and always means so much to me, to my colleagues, and we're really delighted you're here. You'll hear many of your questions we've already worked into the program. If you're not already a member, I hope you might consider joining. Your commitment to art and artists is incredibly important to all of us and makes all of this possible. And you can do this online at moma.org/join. We have received a lot of great questions from MoMA members and through my favorite, Seeing Through Photographs learners. This is an online course that I teach. So hi, everyone. Over the last few days. But we also encourage you to submit your questions to us live because this is a live event, as you could tell when we started. You can do this in the YouTube chat feature or send an email to membership@moma.org, and our producer will pass them along to me. So Nicole and I and Khalil and I will begin with a short conversation, and then we will turn to your questions, although a few of them that we received in advance I've actually already will talk about now. So let's talk about Gordon Parks. He was a singularly talented artist. Simply put, his work with a camera continues to transform our vision of Blackness in America. He was born in 1912 in Fort Scott, Kansas, the youngest of 15 children of a tenant farmer. And even as a child, he suffered from all of the injustices of segregation, a system of oppression that would inform his life's work. These experiences underscored his sense of urgency to harness photography in the fight against ignorance and apathy. When he was a young teenager, his mother died, and he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota to be with his sister, according to his mother's wishes. And he settled there uneasily and temporarily because he didn't get along with his sister's husband. So he struggled to stay in school, facing homelessness and hunger. He worked a dizzying array of jobs, but he also leaned into his considerable talents in all sorts of creative fields. So he slowly began to be able to support himself as a musician and a composer. He acquired his first camera in 1937 and taught himself how to use it. And in 1940, he moved to Chicago, where he had a one-person exhibition of his photographs at the Southside Community Art Center there, which is a very important place. It was likely this exhibition that caught the attention of the jury for the prestigious Julius Rosenwald Fellowship. This fellowship allowed Parks to move to DC with his young family, where he wanted to work with Roy Stryker, who led a group of photographers working under the auspices of the Farm Security Administration. And there were a few questions that came in advance. Al Griffin and Amy Selwyn, who Amy has been a member for 7 years, thanks Amy, they asked questions about this early chapter. So Al noted that photographers speak to each other the way songwriters speak to each other in their songs. Who were the developing and ongoing photographers influencing Parks' development throughout his career? And I'll say at this early chapter, the people who were influencing Parks were the photographers that Roy Stryker encouraged him to look through in the files of the Farm Security Administration. Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Jack Delano, John Vachon, Ben Rothstein, Margaret Post Walcott. These were all photographers that Parks was looking at very intensely when he was in DC. Amy Selwyn asked, what effect do you feel that these experiences had on Parks and his photographic point of view? And as the Farm Security Administration's only Black photographer, he faced considerable discrimination. Washington, D.C. at the time was deeply segregated. And Stryker encouraged him to both encounter and really channel these frustrations into his work, and to recognize that his race provided him with opportunities for access and a perspective that would elude his white colleagues. And this training may have helped him secure fashion and editorial assignments from a range of popular magazines. But in 1948, November 1948, Life magazine published this photograph in an article called Harlem Gang Leader. It was his first feature for that magazine, and they soon hired him to be their first Black staff photographer. Parks was increasingly confident in his ability to use his camera to draw attention to injustice, and he made a great number of stories over the course of his 25 years at Life that addressed poverty, race, and discrimination. Sue Mangan asked this question. She said, did Parks ever experience serious conflict with Life magazine as an African-American photographer, given that the editorial control was in the hands of white editors? So the short answer, yes, definitely. He was understandably frustrated, in particular in the early years of his working for the magazine, by the editor's push to sensationalize this story around Red Jackson, that photograph that we just saw. But he also appreciated the magazine's reach. So while he was frustrated, it wasn't enough to make him think that this wasn't a platform that he didn't want to try to continue to use for justice. Richard Perrin also submitted a question in which he quoted an article by Maurice Berger. And I just want to take one quick moment to acknowledge Maurice Berger's scholarship. He passed away due to COVID earlier this spring, and we really lost a very deep thinker and passionate individual. So I was really glad to see Richard's question that brought Maurice's article from the New York Times this was a November 2015 article, where Berger raises major issues with how Parks's work was misused by Life magazine. And he writes that Richard writes, in this case, the magazine used Parks's series, Harlem Gang Leader, to perpetuate stereotypes, when Parks's intention was to increase awareness of a serious social problem and to encourage programs that helped endangered youth. And when I shared this question with Nicole a little earlier today, she wisely also wanted to draw attention to the editor's decision even to refer to Red Jackson as a Harlem Gang leader. And by this, Nicole, I'm assuming you meant sort of amplifying the damage of these labels that become so reductive and really predict something that, but I hope we'll get into all this and more. But Parks was, you know, an extraordinary artist and an activist. And so each assignment was a way where he found a challenge to make a compelling photograph about a subject that really mattered. So Deepak Joycer asked a question about the formal matters. And in this, you see Parks, it's just masterful. He's got this vanishing perspective, his use of the void, these dynamic compositions, and this kind of ambiguity that he used to challenge stereotypes. So this one is graceful and it's violent, both at the same time. And these kinds of dualities in a single image helps us attend to the multiple perspectives and recognize nuance in this work. So as I mentioned, Parks worked for Life for a quarter of a century. The editors recognized his talent and the value of his perspective as a Black photographer for this largely white magazine, largely white audience. But Parks was not just a photographer. He was also worked with a camera, of course, but also as a musician, as a poet, as a writer. And in the late 1960s, he started making films with comparable success. So this Maybe could we go to the next slide? Great. This is a still from Shaft, which was his second feature-length film, which is notable. It had an unbelievable, unforgettable score, but also the way that Parks was upending biases in casting. So his Black hero, John Shaft, played by Richard Roundtree, was an incredibly influential hero for a lot of people. And I am super delighted and honored that Robin Hickman Winfield submitted a question in advance, and she wrote this: I'm Gordon Parks's great niece. Before he died, he questioned if his life, if his work had had any impact on the lives of young Black males. Robin assured him that it had and promised that his living would not be in vain. And all I can say to that is I agree wholeheartedly. As a photographer, as a filmmaker, Parks was enormously influential. But maybe now I'll stop blabbing and I'll ask Nicole and Khalil if they would each answer, why is Parks so important to you? Maybe we'll start with Khalil this time.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Nicole, for doing this with me. You know, Gordon Parks had the kind of career as a Renaissance man, as an artist, as a citizen of the world that is comparable to people like Paul Robeson, to people like Maya Angelou, meaning the kind of versatility and talent as an individual transcended all genres of creativity, and had the wherewithal to not only speak through his artistry, but also to model how to engage the world and to challenge some of the most pernicious lies and stereotypes and myths about his own community. My father has spent his entire career as a photographer, and the interesting thing is, while he was more directly influenced by Moneta Sleet, who spent 4 decades at Ebony magazine. Ebony was, on its own terms, the magazine of record for Black America, but in many ways was the analog to Life magazine. And so my father worked at Ebony and was influenced by Moneta Sleet, but Moneta Sleet was only about a decade younger than Gordon Parks. And the two of them together represented some of the most incredible artistry behind the lens of a camera and documenting the major movements of African-American life. And we're all grateful for the careers that they had.
That is for sure. Thank you, Khalil. Nicole, do you want to talk a little bit about Parks and what he means, you know, why you think he's important?
Sure, and Sarah, thank you. And Khalil, it's always an honor to be in your presence, your virtual presence. And thank you for your work.
Better in your real presence, but we'll settle for virtual for now.
And you know, that question, it seems so simple, Sarah, but it's like really profound. And it was actually the question, thank you for sending in advance. And I was like, oh my goodness, how am I supposed to address the importance of Gordon Parks in 2 minutes? I mean, he really is a singular figure, and a figure who but there's not one Gordon Parks. There's the Gordon Parks, the filmmaker, or the memoirist, and he's a beautiful writer, like a gorgeous writer. But for today, we're going to focus on his, 6 decades of photography, right? He's just a gorgeous writer. And 3 things that I just want to throw out there for a very short time together that really stands out to me as someone who does visual culture and African-American art is his importance for cultivating a visual language around Blackness in the 20th century. And what I mean by that is that he masters social documentary photography, right? He's just like so incredible at it, but he's able to bring it together with the poetry around Black everyday life that I don't think anyone can do in that kind of way that, you look at a Parks image and it's a Parks image. And it's because of the beauty and the poetry of the image, the nuance of the image, always against the backdrop of racial subjugation and anti-Black violence. So that's one of the things that for me, in terms of just the work I do and also a generation of Black photographers that I write about and work with, I see that influence on them. But I also want to say that I think he's really astute and thoughtful and forward thinking about that complex relationship that he has with Life magazine. Not only is he creating a new image repertoire for how to represent Black people and Black struggle, but he's actually cultivating a new public. he is saying that the public that Life has been addressing is too narrow. It's a race-based idea of the public. And he's also changing who is the subject of stories in Life magazines, and not in a way that has objectified Blacks historically. He's working against, he's visually articulating an aesthetic and a politics that is refuting the centuries-long representation of racist and violent representations of Black people.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. I want to dig in a little bit more to this idea of photojournalism and sort of ethics of observation, because Jackie Handy, a MoMA member, and Sean Yetter, our marvelous producer, I hope I'm allowed to shout out Sean, they both ask questions about these things. And the question of how do you understand the balance between ostensibly neutral documentation and a personal commitment and point of view, or why does it matter who is behind the camera? In what ways does it matter who's behind the camera? So maybe if each of you would sort of speak to this idea of the ethics of photojournalism, and maybe Khalil, if you would talk a little bit more about your father too. I know people would be interested, because if that was ever an issue, if that was ever discussed.
Sure. Well, yeah, I can talk a little bit more about my dad. So my father, Ozir Muhammad, spent his entire career as a photojournalist, working for various publications from Ebony and Jet magazines in the 70s to the Charlotte Observer in the 80s, Newsday, and then the New York Times, where he retired after 25 years. What I can say for his career, having borne witness to it and gone on assignment with him, is that there was never a bright line between how he functioned as someone who was documenting the news of the day and how he composed pictures as an expression of seeing things that people might see differently. I mean, sort of photojournalism or photography 101 is that the eye is in the hands of the beholder, meaning that what people see behind the lens is not universal. It has everything to do with the moment. It has everything to do with what you crop, what is in focus and what is not. And so while we might think a picture is worth 1,000 words as a kind of objective record of what's happened, I certainly learned from my father, and I learned from people like Deb Willis, one of the most influential photo curators and historians of the genre itself, particularly for Black photographers.
I'd say the field as a whole. Let's give her a big
right.
Yeah.
That's right. These photographers are never making the kind of distinction. Now, the truth is, and we've already talked about this, editors often do. And so what a photographer might present who works as a journalist to pay the bill, so to speak, may have less control over what the editor wants, not only in what is printed, but also in how that itself is cropped. Mm-hmm. And so there are layers of essentially storytelling that happen between what the photographer sees in the lens and what shows up in print for the photojournalist. But my father, like so many, like Moneta Sleet, like Gordon Parks and so many others, went on to have careers within the museum world, within the art gallery world, where they were able to speak for themselves in terms of what they wanted their work to say.
And I would add one more layer to that, which is also what we bring to the images when we see them. So, mm-hmm. So much happens between the artist and the camera and what we are given as viewers. And then maybe, actually, I'll be quiet, because I do want to hear Nicole speak to this question of photojournalism. And like, you know, Nicole and I had the privilege of looking at the same picture and seeing different things and using that as an opportunity for learning and thinking together.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And shout out to Deb Willis, who's also one of my mentors, and like, you know, she's so influential in creating a generation or a couple of generations of Black art historians and photographers and people working broadly in visual culture. So we love Deb Willis. And in fact, the one time I met Gordon Parks was with Deb Willis. She invited me to go to an exhibit, and he was there, and he was impeccably dressed. I mean, just stunning. And I think that's, you know, that is his reputation, right? And, you know, that is this kind of flaneur in New York City. So I want to also just hold up that image. But this question for me, it strikes a chord in so many ways. And for one, I think that Parks has spoken so much about his relationship between, quote, the objectivity of a genre and his personal commitments. And I think that his aesthetic and political imperatives trump any kind of fidelity to a genre or a type of practice. And one of his most famous quotes is that he chose the camera as a weapon of choice, right? But there's another that, related to that is a quote where he says, a weapon against poverty, against racism, against all sorts of social wrongs. So he is very committed to like where and how he's angling that weapon, right? And how he's using and activating that weapon. And I think, his series that he did also in life a year before The Atmosphere of Crime, this is 1956.
We go pull that slide up for one more second while Nicole's talking about it.
Put that up because that image for me is so compelling, that the entire series. And if you haven't had an opportunity to check it out, so when it was published in Life magazine in 1956, it was under the title Restraints, Open and Hidden, and it's looking at Jim Crow segregation. It has been republished in its entirety because Life magazine shows like 26 of the images as part of the segregation story. And I want to shout out Peter Kuhnhart and the incredible work of the Gordon Parks Foundation to archive his incredible work and to produce them in these beautiful catalogs and also exhibitions. And because of the work of the Gordon Parks Foundation, we're actually having this opportunity to go back to like works of his that many of us didn't even know exist. And this story, the segregation story, I mean, one of the things that art historians and critics write about is the fact that he chose color, right? And he also chose this kind of cinematic style when much of the segregated South was being photographed in black and white. And he also used this as an opportunity to work with a young Black journalist. And in his autobiography, he talks about some of the ordeals that they've experienced that I think gets at also some of the kind of ethics of photojournalism and collaborating with Life, for example. So with their contact from Life magazine, who was like a regional bureau there, actually set them up with a bodyguard who was working for basically the KKK, right? And so, I mean, and set them up in a way that they had to flee. So he has written about like that as part of the complexity of these relationships. And I also think that he's pushing during his time with Life magazine to work within the field of photojournalism, but to do something much more complexly. And I go back to that photograph of Red Jackson, and I don't see that, and I see that as a photograph that's done with deep empathy and actual love, right? He talks about him being a 17-year-old boy with very few options, right? Outside of the informal economy. And he's also written about his first time being invited to an execution. And he says, I see myself in that person, right? And he's also saying that he wants to flee from this moment, but he's forced to bear witness because he's taken up this weapon as a photographer to document these social ills.
And I actually think that's a perfect segue about taking up this camera as a weapon for all of these issues, because Anthony Cobbs submitted a question live that just came in, and I think it's one that we should all think about. He said he notices viewers turning into night from around the world. Can we talk about why Parks's work appeals to so many different cultures, many of which didn't experience American-style racism? And to me, I'll give a short answer, but I would invite each of you to respond as well. It's that ability to, first of all, create unforgettable images. In the hands of talented photographers, the unruly world is sort of distilled and synthesized into something memorable. It's not like days, you see it and you can't forget it. But I think also that commitment to showing how poverty and discrimination and racism and how a camera can be used to confront these evils is it's not solely an American story. But I don't know if either one of you want to respond to Anthony's questions as well.
I want to say something about that. And can we go back to the department store image? Because for me, that is, you know, it's the care and the precision he puts into documenting the visual symbols of Jim Crow segregation. So we see the colored entrance sign, and also the care and precision of Black fashion survival practices, right? So this, like, these impeccably dressed, we assume mother and daughter, right? Who are, you know, performing acts of fearlessness and dignity in a system that in every moment is trying to enforce their dehumanization. So I think that he's able to capture this kind of urgency, but there's also something timeless about how he uses his camera to do that work.
And can I just add one more thing about this picture? Because I'm always struck, you know, that he includes the handrail in the foreground there, picking up on the sort of structure of the sign. So he's making sure that it's kind of got an echo in the picture. And similarly, the red words above echoing that woman walking away. It's like, these are tiny things, but when you really spend time with the work, you notice so much. Yes, absolutely what you're saying about the dignity and the specificity, but also making a picture that just is rewarding to spend time with.
Can I add one thing about
Please,
the picture? Because, I mean, in addition to everything that's already been said so brilliantly, there's also a reminder here that Parks is speaking to, which is that segregation is literally hardwired. It's not accidental. It's not random. It's not off to the side. So much of the imagery we see of segregation, not only, of course, is Black and white, but it's the kind of impromptu colored only sign. But here, the retailer wants Black people's money, creates a
sign.
Right, hardwires a colored entrance sign.
I mean,
so it's just really fascinating. Just to the point about the international community. I mean, first of all, it's a testament to MoMA's reach in the world. That's obvious. But also, it says something about the universalism of the Black freedom struggle. That you can go anywhere in the world, for the most part, and you will meet people in an international community who, quite frankly, know more about what happened in this country around the treatment of African Americans and their resistance against it than many Americans in this country know of their own history. And I think that Gordon Parks, because of the breadth of his work, has been an entry point for decades for people looking to the American scene, both out of horror and out of inspiration.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm so happy to be doing this with you both tonight. I can't even tell you. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a little bit about a specific photo essay that Gordon Parks did called The Atmosphere of Crime. And this was a series, again, a little shout out for the Gordon Parks Foundation. Nicole and I were honored to be contributors to this book. I was given the privilege of going through the archives, selecting and working with Peter Kunhardt and the team there on selecting and sequencing this book. And now, again, it's another opportunity to understand in depth Parks's work. This series in particular spoke so much to me. This is the first page of the spread, the first spread from Life magazine. It was a 6-part series looking at crime in the US. Parks's portfolio within this inaugural story was called The Atmosphere of Crime. And it is an extraordinary body of work that is only represented in 12 images in Life magazine. So it really, until this book, was largely unknown. And we also feel so lucky. I don't know, Nicole, if you realize this, but the book was printed just before COVID shut down all of the printing in Europe. So I'm just so grateful that it exists. And the Parks Foundation really champions all these causes that Parks championed in his lifetime. And I just want to say, Nicole, how much your essay in this book means to me, how much Brian Stevenson's essay in this book means to me, and the way that you all have taught me to see more in Parks's work. So the museum purchased all of the color plates from this book. And these are more than 50 images that look at police activity with blistering specificity, as you've pointed out, Nicole. But they also look at purported criminal activity with a more questioning eye. And they absolutely, as you've also pointed out, they preserve the anonymity of the people who are accused or in the process of being accused of these crimes. And so that idea of your point of view, how it's the backlighting, the cropping, they just, they do this so powerfully. I think also these nuances, this duality that harkens back to the earlier stories for life, to that segregation story picture. But in this, and this was one that at the time the museum purchased all of those color prints, the Gordon Parks Foundation gave us this early black and white print. And I just love the way that one hand is sort of casually dangling a cigarette or feigning a casual posture, which could be impossible in such a circumstance. But the other hand is pointing to this tension or frustration of being locked behind bars. So before I ask each of you to respond to this series in particular, I hope you don't mind if I use my colleague River Ancalata Bullock's excellent question as a point of departure. And River wrote, how do you understand Parks's legacy or his work for the atmosphere of crime, specifically in relation to the work of decarceration and abolition? And I would love to hear both of you speak to this series in general and to River's question.
Nicole, why don't you go first, since you've had more time with the work?
Thank you, Khalil. You're super generous. So, and Sarah and I did have a back and forth and some disagreements, which I think were incredibly productive. It was a moment for us actually to get to know each other through emails, and it was around my interpretation of this series, and my choice also to focus on what I found most compelling is the detail and the rigor that Parks chooses to capture police work. So I see this series as better titled police work in the production of crime than the atmosphere of crime, because we see the relationship between over-policing or hyper-policing of certain communities and contact with police. And what we know is the more a neighborhood is policed, the more contact subjects, quote, criminal subjects have with police, the more likely arrests will happen. So literally, the process of policing is one of producing crime and criminal suspects. And so he shows like the rating, the arrests, the indexing, so the kind of also administrative and bureaucratic types of violence that's also a part of production of the idea of crime and police work. And I used the scholarship of a American Studies scholar, I think one of Khalil's former colleagues, Miko Siegel, who just recently came out with a brilliant book called Violence Work. And it's saying that police work is state-targeted, state-operated violence. And that's the kind of nuts and bolts of police work. And I'm very inspired, thank you, River, for this question about the current moment of activism where people are really making those links. Miriam Makaba, who's a really well-known abolitionist activist writing in the New York Times, when we say abolish police, we literally mean abolish police, right? That's saying that reform is not an answer. And I know that Khalil has written about like the failures of reform and the concept going back to like whenever there's an episodic moment talking about police reform, but that we have to understand that the very foundations of policing, especially in the policing in the US, is anti-poor people, anti-Black people, anti-Indigenous people. It is about the reproduction of state power and the benefits of people in power.
That's great, and a really nice compliment to some things that I wanted to say about the series. First of all, what's fascinating is the stylized presentation of this shadowy world that is implied by the title of the series, Atmosphere of Crime. And what's really compelling, I think, is if we go back to the 1950s, the decade opens with two things happening. One, the wars just ended. A whole bunch of babies have been born. And there's been a lot of anxiety about whether or not those children have had the same advantages because many of their fathers were not there when they were very young, and many of their fathers never came home. And so part of the subtext of what is going on by the end of the decade is this anxiety about a generation of young people who were born, say, in 1940, are now coming of age in 1957. And they're juveniles in a way that are wreaking havoc on the society. I mean, this is really the height of anxiety about teen violence, about, I mean, this is the universe that inspires West Side Story and Blackboard Jungle, which features Sidney Poitier. This is anxiety about white flight, where the white people who are left behind in these cities seem to be increasingly under siege by the influences of Puerto Ricans and African Americans and other unsavory immigrant types or migrants who are polluting the social purity of the city. It is also a decade that opens with Dragnet, which is one of the first stylized police procedurals, which is part of a moment of police professionalization, which is really, as we now know, a form of propaganda or propaganda for law enforcement that continues right up to this very day. So what I think that Parks is doing, at least as I read the context of this, is the stylized version of what we see, these beautiful bokeh images, is the question of crime is like, who really is the criminal in this story? Is it the people who are being arrested, or is it the police? Now, part of the story of policing at this moment, and the reason why their image is being cleaned up, is because you now have this massive concern about organized crime that will lead to a massive Senate investigation at the beginning of the decade. Labor racketeering will end the decade with Senate investigations. And you don't get organized crime or labor racketeering without police corruption. So I think Parks, coming off of a career where he's had to fight the battle of Black dignity, he's had to deal with whether or not a young Black man named Red Jackson can be featured in his full humanity in a social context and not simply as a delinquent, is asking a question, you know, who are the criminals in this story? And that we could think about the echo of an earlier gang series as also turning the lens on the police themselves. The image of those two officers, if you could go back to it, kicking in the door with their guns drawn, might look heroic in the eyes of the silent majority or middle white America. But for too many Black people who had had their doors kicked in the 1930s in Harlem and in many other places around the country, this was not heroes coming to the rescue. This was a form of racial control and surveillance. And so they could literally be understood as another form of a gang. So that's what's so fascinating. The actual presentation itself is a way of visually saying the lines are very blurry here.
Mm-hmm. And the resonance, Khalil, I just want to jump up. The resonance, I mean, we're thinking about Breonna Taylor, that, you know, these raids by officers continuing today that ends with the loss of Black life.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. We have another live comment that I will just want to acknowledge, but then I really want to turn. So Alexis Elliott writes that when she first saw these images, she really appreciated how Parks kept the people anonymous, or some of the people, allowing them to simply be there as a subject without being judged. And this is something that you write about very persuasively, Nicole, in your essay in the book. And that idea of, you know, what does a silhouette do to preserve anonymity or cropping or a dramatic point of view? So Alexis, I'll just say yes. But I would like to ask Nicole and Khalil. Oh yeah, please.
I just want to chime in, and I'll say this a little later too, that I think it's also, like, I completely agree with Khalil's assessment of who's the criminal, like that's what's happening visually in these beautiful, really rich photographs. And I also think that he is working against criminal indexes, especially the mugshot. So he's not doing the work of the mugshot, which make someone, quote, a criminal when they're literally just arrested and suspected of something, right? So he's working against that archive and how that archive has worked in really pernicious ways against especially Black and poor people and people, you know, with drug dependencies and the like, right? The most vulnerable populations. And he knows the power of those images in police profiles.
Can I add one more thing to this?
I couldn't be happier. No, this is just what I was dreaming this would be. Yeah, so yes.
This is exactly the influence of the Great Depression and the photographers who captured it, the Dorothea Lange and others, who really saw for a left behind America the face of humanity at its finest. Mm-hmm. And because Parks spent the decade preceding this series in the 1940s, we really do get a sense that he wants to tell a very different kind of story about what it means to be at the bottom of a society. That doesn't mean that one's moral character is reflected in that position.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a perfect segue. The one thing I wanted to touch on before we turn to other questions was to ask each of you, you know, we're so fortunate to have you both here tonight. Would you please each speak to your own research, to, you know, broader questions of the criminal justice system, for our readers who, you know, I happen, you know, as I said, I happen to own both these books, but maybe, and I think, Nicole, was I your first pre-order on Amazon? I think when Nicole...
You would like to imagine yourself as
okay,
that.
I was in the top 100. Top 100. Anyway, so anyway, if you would each please, for our audiences who might not be familiar with your work in these projects, if you would please speak to them. Maybe Khalil, if you'd go first, and then Nicole, I also want to talk about your project, MoMA PS1.
So for the most curious amongst our audience tonight, there's an interesting figure who shows up in the Atmosphere of Crime and the Crime in the U.S. feature, who is a sociologist named Thorsten Selin. He's actually, he's a Swedish-born Ivy League sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. That's right. And he is the authoritative voice in this story about a scourge and uptick of crime that is happening nationally, and a particular kind of violent crime. And what Selin had spent his entire career doing, going back to the early 1910s, I write about him in The Condemnation of Blackness, is discrediting the idea that crime statistics were an objective, neutral index of criminal behavior. He always saw crime statistics within a broader social context that was tied to political control, to power, that the use of quantification itself was a form of domination and oppression. And because he had been Swedish born and reared and had come to the United States, he was quite taken with the explicit racism of the country in the 1920s when he began to write about these issues. And essentially, as an outsider, really turned on their head the understanding that you could use crime statistics about African Americans as evidence that they were a criminal class or that they were excessively criminal. He called this into question time and time again. In many ways, I will admit this, I never knew that Selin contributed to this article. Okay. I've never even seen a picture of Selin, even though I've literally studied his entire body of work that pertains to African Americans. And so if you read The Condemnation of Blackness, which is a story about racial criminalization and the role that crime statistics played in that process, you will read a quote from Thorsten Selin on, I believe, the second page of the book. So thank you, Sarah, for
I have it underlined in your book, and yes, it is true. I think it is actually on page 2 at the top. Yeah. Thank you, Khalil. And Nicole, we have had the privilege of working together not only on this, but about your book. Where okay, fine, I wasn't even the top 100.
You were, yes, you were. Claim it.
I'm a fan.
You were.
Whereas Khalil's, I only have the second edition of Khalil, so you can tell I'm catching up, but I'm a little later to that game.
Well, you were my first pre-order, and also just I want to shout out to Harvard University Press because they've been really fantastic to work with on this book, Marking Time: Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And basically, it's a study, it's a project I've worked on for about a decade, looking at the impact of the carceral state on contemporary culture, contemporary art practices, and really thinking about how to put the incredible aesthetic engagements in art making that's taking place inside prisons. One, as a kind of counterpoint to like criminal indexes, what we were talking about, mugshots and like state records, and the really brilliant work that Khalil and others have done on like biometric data and the way that, social science discourse has shaped notions of the criminal type. So I really was interested. I saw not as much engagement with thinking about how culture has been impacted by the carceral state and mass incarceration. So that's what I spent like the past several years working on. The book consists of like over 70 interviews with currently and formerly incarcerated artists, thinking about like really the kind of incredible collectives that they're making in prison. You can go to the next slide. The ways that they're kind of experimenting with like spatial captivity, material constraints, and also this kind of existential reality of like time as punishment, that you wake up and you're being punished, you shower, you're being punished, you're eating, you're being punished, right? That is something that unless we've been in prison, we can't really understand that, how it shapes our experience of life and time. And so I look at the work of, I'm showing you Gilberto Rivera's An Institutional Nightmare, and this is a mixed media collage that involves his prison, his state issued clothing that he actually used in the service of art making. And you see a lot of ways that in the book, how artists will take the very limited materials available for them to create these works, and how they also kind of resource pool. So they're sharing materials with each other, they're peer mentoring, they're teaching each other. And it's part of like this larger kind of pedagogy of incarcerated people where they're teaching each other all kinds of practices. There's a whole school and kind of tradition of art making. But I'm very curious and committed to thinking about how those works speak to contemporary art practices of non-incarcerated artists. So you have also an image of Sable Elise Smith's Pivot 2, which is a sculptor. Sable has never been incarcerated, but her work is very much thinking about carcerality and its impact on Black family structures and the like. You can go to the next image. As part of the research and publication of this book, I've been in conversation with Kate Fowl, who's the director of PS1, and I'm very, very happy that PS1 invited me to curate an exhibition based on the book. It was supposed to open in April, but due to the pandemic, it's been postponed. We hope that it will open in the early fall. Tamika Cole's this great graphite collage that she did while she was on work release in Alabama is one of the signature pieces in the show, and it's also been, we've been using it to market the show, but I think it gets at a lot of the kind of subject matter and the kind of material constraints, and also like just the experimentation that's taking place in prison. And so it's called Locked in a Dark Calm. It's a piece of office paper and discarded magazines that she was able to assemble for this collage in graphite pencil. So it's thinking about the simplicity of these materials that are also used and utilized to launch really major critiques of the carceral state.
Yeah, well, everyone now understands why we are so fortunate to have you both with us tonight. So thank you. We have so many good questions that are coming in too. So I'm going to try to kind of get through a handful of them at least. David Solo, hi David, I actually know him personally. I did not know that he had been a MoMA member for 23 years. So thank you, David, for that. And David asks, both in life and in many of Parks's book, prose and poetry, mostly Parks's, play a significant role. Can you comment more on his process for creating text and image? Are they in tandem? Which one was usually first? And how he uses the combination to shape the reading of his work. And I'm just going to pick a little sliver of this question to answer because I want to get to other things as well. But what I find striking is that when you follow the arc of Parks's engagement with Life magazine, he is increasingly being asked to not only be a photographer, but also an author. And that recognition of, instead of that tension that you sense early in his career, where the editors are cropping things in a certain way, characterizing the work in a certain way, naming people in a certain way, as you go on, you see more and more articles written by Parks. A 1963 article on Black Muslims, a 1968 article on poverty, also a 1968 article in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And I don't know, honestly, which came first for Parks. All I'll say is that, as Khalil pointed to earlier, this is an incredibly multivalent talent. You know, he is able to summon words that tell stories that pictures couldn't, and he is able to share with us pictures that can't be distilled into words. And, you know, there are very few people who are able to do that. But there's so many other good questions that I want to, yeah, please. Yeah. Always jump in.
If people want to know more about him, I recommend that they watch the documentary Half Past Autumn. It's really beautiful. And in it, like, for example, they talk about his composing and how he never formally studied the piano, but like how the piano was like a vehicle for him to express certain aspects of society and emotions that he couldn't do visually. Like, so he is someone who's like had all these kind of all this media available to him that he was using. I mean, it's all part of his larger vision, but I think that he's expressing different components of his like creativity and his imagination through these different vehicles.
Yeah, and I think E. Oakes and Howard Gardner also submitted questions asking about his work as a composer and filmmaker and their relation to his photography. And I think he really is, he can choose a medium and express something meaningful through that. You know, most of us I admire any artist who can express themselves in one medium, or a scholar who can express themselves through research and words. That he can do all of these is really
and I think it's just one more thing to point out. He also was in an incredibly fervent community, and so he was collaborating with Ralph Ellison. The image we showed earlier of the man appearing to come out of a sewer hole was an explicit collaboration in Life magazine. In the 1952 spread, a man becomes invisible to be part of the photographic images that appeared in an edition of Invisible Man. So he was also learning from his peers among some of the most brilliant people in the community.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So Jeff Huang asked this question, and I would love to hear both of you answer it. He asked, what do you think is the role of art in engendering social and political change? So using Gordon Parks as an example, how do you think art can further the social justice movements of yesterday and today going forward?
And I mean, that's just to piggyback off of what Khalil just said about the time period, especially the mid-century and civil rights era, where Parks is in conversation with a lot of thinkers, artists, and activists. And they don't see a separation. I mean, well, there are debates about the relationship between art and politics, and people have talked about, like, James Baldwin, and his critique, for example, of Native Son, right? Mm-hmm. So there's these ongoing, but these artists and thinkers and activists, they're working across various modalities in their fight, in their freedom struggles. And art is central. It's a central component to what they're doing. I mean, there are reasons that we have such iconic visuals of the civil rights era. There's a reason why the I Am a Man photograph cues up so much for people, right? Symbolically, and as Khalil said, is it kind of has a global resonance for people about also the specificity of struggles in the US, but also the ways that people, especially oppressed people across the world, can connect to those struggles. So I think that the history of Black creativity and the history of Black people on this continent and the history of our freedom struggles is one of creative engagement and of making things anew constantly, but always kind of with deep resonance of like generations before us and what they've done.
Yeah. I mean, the shorthand way of putting that is that Gordon Parks put the capital B in Black before the Associated Press did.
Oh my God. Maybe we should just go home now. Yes. Thank you. So there is, oh my gosh, there's so many great questions, and we need to be moving on to the final one. But I'll ask, maybe I'll end with one question from Laura Lalinde, who asked me, if you don't mind, I'll end with this. But then maybe we'll have more time for one more with you. But she asked, how have the events of the last months, our nation's national reckoning, shifted your thoughts or plans for installing Parks's work in the galleries at MoMA this fall, or we hope this fall? And you know, I will say it is a moment to be humble. It is a moment to be grateful to have access to voices and insight like yours. It's a moment to do my own work, meaning like I had not read the new Frederick Douglass biography, and like, you know, I bought it from a Black-owned bookstore and I'm gonna, you know, read it. But it is partly what I'm excited about is the idea of putting these works on view and inviting, through presenting different perspectives and ideas and modes of access into Parks's work, encouraging our audiences to come up with their own. And like when we're doing our job as a museum well, we are bringing forward great art that has, yes, defined history, has defined, you know, these unforgettable things, but also helping our audiences grapple with the complexities behind it. So I'm so grateful to both of you for being with us tonight. It is, you know, I hope we will continue the conversation in many ways. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm just scrolling down to who and joined us from where. And right now, people are joining us from Brazil, Melbourne, Sydney, Vancouver, Canada, Los Angeles, Forest Hills, Washington, DC, Florida, Anaheim, California, Buenos Aires, Niantic. That's kind of where I am. New Haven, Glen Mills, Montreal, Wilmington, North Carolina, Tijuana, Mexico, Atlanta, Georgia, Essen, Germany, Lake Placid, Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm sure I'm leaving some out. So to all of you, thank you for caring. Thank you for learning with me. And remember that you can stay up to date with everything that's happening at the museum on Magazine, MoMA's online platform, and on MoMA.org, where there's a lot of great material on Gordon Parks. And be sure to tune in next week, or no, it's not next week, but for our next virtual views, which will be a live Q&A with Martino Sterli, our fantastic curator of architecture and design, who's going to explore New York's iconic skyline with two of today's brightest architectural minds, Liz Diller and Mabel Wilson. And I can't wait for that one. I really appreciate the help from everyone around the museum who made tonight possible. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Be well, be safe, and we look forward to seeing you at the museum as soon as we can possibly reopen safely again. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Khalil.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Sarah.
Behind the scenes, making this happen.
All thanks to you both. Thank you.